Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today what I thought we could go through is, I just wanted to touch on 3 really important exercises to treat shoulder impingement. Now shoulder impingement, for those who don't know, is it generally refers to a space, a natural space in the shoulder, where within that space there's certain tissue that can get jammed up and irritated and become sore. So what we often find is if you place your finger on the tip of your shoulder, there's a bony piece that you can generally feel. If you slide off that, you'll hit some soft tissue and the top of the actual arm itself. Now there should ideally be, deeper to this, a bit of a gap in there where the bony top and the head of the humerus, the top of the arm, should have a decent gap there. And in that gap is the supraspinatus, or one of the rotator cuff muscles, which runs from the top of the shoulder through a little bony spot and out to the other side. And on top of that, there's what we call a bursa, which is basically a sac of fluid that acts as a lubricator for areas of high friction. And of course, a tendon running across a bone or running through a gap is a great place to try and decrease friction so that we don't get irritation, inflammation, and damage long term. Now, one of the things that we know with impingement is that when someone has impingement, we often look at that as a natural, or can look at it as a natural thing that's happened. Like you've just got to a point where the joint space is decreased and that tendon or that bursa has become irritated and impinging. But what we see clinically is that there's some obvious mechanical problems that lead to that space decreasing and becoming dysfunctional, and other things becoming sore as well. So one of the things that we want to look for is, and we address this in the exercises that we'll get to in a little bit, is we want to make sure that we're taking care of the dysfunction that sets up that impingement to be there. And there's probably 3 really simple things that we can do to clear up a lot of that dysfunction that we accrue without realizing it, to sort of feed some more slack into that space, feed some slack to the tissues that are irritated, and sort of ask them to settle down naturally. And I guess one of the things that can happen with impingement is, if we're putting sort of some altered stress through that shoulder and the way we're loading up that part of the shoulder has been dysfunctional for a long time, we can get things called osteophytes, which are sort of bony growths sort of in that space. So instead of it being a nice sort of a smooth space for tissue to slide around and move around in, you can start to develop a little bit of a sharp edge or some bony prominence, or an osteophyte, as we said, that it can start to shear and irritate and potentially cause tearing and degeneration over time. So, but the important thing is that apart from an operation that some people may need to clear that up, the crux of most treatment has to focus on not just trying to settle down the symptoms, but trying to take a step back and focus on the mechanical flaws that have led to those symptoms. And clinically, I find if we focus on these areas, we can restore normal motion, normal loading, normal function to that area as quickly as possible, which can then help alleviate those symptoms almost permanently. And then if you've done that and everything's functioning really well and you still have some issues, then potentially that's the only time that you might need some surgery to clear up anything that's become physically different than what it would otherwise be. So before we get to these exercises, I'd really appreciate it if you do go on to like the video. Please leave a like below, and if you would consider subscribing if you're new. We're trying to put out helpful content as much as possible, things that are hopefully actionable and useful in real time for real situations. And the way YouTube works is that the more interaction you get, the more support you can generate, the more these videos reach people. So the plan is to obviously help as many people as possible, so the more that you guys can help with that, obviously the better. So to get straight into it, the first thing I think that's really important to give this context is the single biggest reason why an impingement happens from what I see clinically, and this sort of sets up the reason why I want to go through these exercises in a second, is the number one thing is that without you realizing it, you're putting your shoulder in a bad position constantly. So we know in a perfect world, with those shoulders comfortably back, that gap and that sort of subacromial space, which is where a lot of the tissue can get impinged, in a great posture, that space is normal. And what we also find is that as soon as we start to deviate from that and we see a shoulder sort of drop down and roll forwards, automatically we're closing down that space and altering the loading pattern of all the tissue in that area. So how it can look, so instead of being in a really good position here, that shoulder tends to roll further forward. So instead of it being a sort of a shoulder blade that's flat against the back, we often see a shoulder that's more rounded and dropped. And while it can seem on the surface that a drop through the shoulder and through the arm here can overload the tendons in there, and it certainly can, it can also be a haven for stiffness and tightness that you accrue, so that when you then use that arm and shoulder, you're doing so with a handbrake on. And not only that, but if your natural default posture when you're on the computer or you're sitting down to watch TV or driving or using your phone is this shape, that then becomes more likely to be the shape that you start to move from. And one of the really important tests that we do clinically to highlight this is, if we're in a really nice up tall posture with our shoulders back and our rib cage and our upper back in a good position, we can have full access to our inherent range of motion. And normal's about 180, and I probably have a little bit more than that. But what we see is, as soon as you put your body in a bad position, then all of a sudden you start to lose a lot of that range. You run out of space and you can start to jam up a lot of tissues because it's in a bad position. So hopefully this translates across on the video, but by putting myself in a better position, I then get full access to that range of motion again. So I guess the crucial concept that I want to promote with impingement is that the pain and the discomfort and the potential damage that you're dealing with is not an isolated problem. That tissue is just the tissue that has become dysfunctional because of the broader mechanical dysfunction that's going on. And it starts with the positions and the postures that you're in. So I guess the lesson from this is, the number one thing you have to be aware of and have to make yourself aware of is, from the moment that you get out of bed to the moment that you fall asleep, what positions and shapes are you putting those shoulders in and keeping them there? And if there's a common theme throughout your day, and it may not be the same thing the whole time, like you might sit at the computer for an hour or two and then get up and move around because you're trying to do the right thing, but then you might be at the dishes, doing some dishes in the same posture, and then to have a break you might be sort of relaxed on the couch using your phone, and then you might be actually doing something with your arms and shoulders, but you're doing it from a position that's less than ideal. So I guess that foundational concept is highly important. If you can't practice better positions, it's very hard to fix impingement long term, period. And if you have surgery, that's great, that might help you, but if you're still in the same bad shapes and creating the same bad habits, there's no guarantee that it's going to stay feeling good, or something else isn't going to become a problem, whether it's your neck or your upper back, or tendons at the front of your shoulder, your rotator cuff, whatever it might be. So I wanted to make that very clear to start with. It is the most important mechanical thing to be aware of. Now, the rest of these exercises, so these 3 exercises that we spoke about, 3 really good exercises to try and improve the function of the shoulder and ultimately that impingement. The first thing we want to go after is the upper back, and we can do that with a ball. So this is a lacrosse ball, we can use a tennis ball, a baseball, softball, whatever you would like to use. But again, the reason why this is really important is that any time spent in this rounded posture, the weight of the arm is always pulling and hanging off the tissue in the upper back because it's all connected. And again, after a while of being sort of overloaded, that tissue begins to sort of tighten and stiffen to tolerate that change in load. So if you then have this tight area and then try and move your arm on top of that, you've got this handbrake for normal function, which again, this stops moving really well, so the next joint along, the shoulder joint, can then be overloaded differently or loaded differently and cause some problems. So we can use a ball as we've done previously. We're going to get the ball into the top of our upper back where the bumps are, and then just move it straight off to one side. So in between that shoulder blade and the spine, in that area. And we want to basically get you to lie down on that ball. So it's just on the inside of my shoulder blade and just out from the spine. And I just want to move the ball from left to right, sort of from outside to in and up and down, until I find something that feels stiff. And for me, coming out onto the rib cage, just inside of that shoulder blade, I feel something that feels stiff. So with my arm here, I want to bring it up over the top, and I want to try and get my forearm to the ground. So for me, with the ball there, this is as far as I can go to start with. But what you'll hopefully see is that the more I do this, just using movement to shear this free, in a short amount of time, as that rib starts to give, you should start to see more of my face, and then my arm gets closer and closer to the ground. And what we want to do here is, just to highlight this, in terms of the range of motion that I have, within a short amount of time, it should go back even further than it did before. So I think for me, I was probably just past sort of 180, but now I feel like I've got a little bit more movement in that, a little bit more space to play with. So by taking that handbrake off here, it's giving me more space to move, takes the pressure off indirectly from the tip of that shoulder. So one of the things that often gets missed with shoulder impingement is that almost everyone who has shoulder impingement has a really stiff, tight, immobile upper back, which is just a handicap for normal function. So a ball is a fantastic way to go after that stiffness and tightness. You can go from the upper back, you can sort of bleed that up into the neck a little bit, go up higher into the neck. We're just looking for stiffness and tightness. We want to put constant pressure on it and use movement to sort of shear that free, and then just move up or down or further out to the side and keep looking for what you feel is stiff and tight. And following on from that, the second part of this, the second exercise or the second part of this exercise, we can use the ball again, but this time, instead of just being on the upper back, on the inside of the shoulder blade, a lot of the tissue on the shoulder blade at the back of the shoulder also gets tight for the exact same reason. So if we're in this sort of rounded off shape, not only are we pulling through all this tissue consistently, but the weight of the arm attaching to the actual shoulder blade itself, we also get this sort of lower down pulling at the same time. So this gets stiff up here, this gets tight sort of at the back of the shoulder as well. So we want to go after the same thing with the ball. And what we want to do is the same deal again. So we want to place the ball at the back of the shoulder, and again, you'll know where this is. You can start lying on your back, but you might need to roll off to the side a little bit just to get a bit of pressure on it. And what I'd like you to do is with your arm, you can bring your arm up just to open up the back, so you can come up as high as you feel comfortable. And we're looking for some tightness and some stiffness or some tenderness that we want to start to get rid of. So you've got two options with this one. Once we find a spot that feels tight, we just want to stay there, let the ball sort of press in, let it free up. The other thing that you can do is keeping your elbow on the ground if you can. We can start to generate some downward rotation or some inward rotation without letting that shoulder come up. We want that shoulder to stay down. We just want to rotate downwards as far as we feel comfortable, again, trying to shear free some of that muscular tightness. And one of the sneaky things about the muscular tightness at the back of the shoulder is that movement, that internal rotation, where the arm rotates downwards or rotates inwards, that movement, if we're very tight and stiff at the back, what we often see, if we're missing that internal rotation, then as soon as you need to do something like reach behind your back or get into an awkward position, instead of having the range of motion to keep your shoulder blade back, if you can only get to a certain point, your body has to cheat and throw that shoulder forwards to give you the ability to get your hand down, but it's coming at a sacrifice. So without having that rotation in your shoulder, we can't maintain a good shoulder position and express sort of full range of motion through that arm. So again, this position really jams up and overloads that part of the shoulder, leading to some impingement and all the issues that coincide with that. So that when we're trying to do something, we're all of a sudden generating more load, more dysfunctional loads to that area, setting it up for problems. So not only do we need to free up the upper back, we have to free up the tissue at the back of the shoulder to give it some breathing room and allow it to move normally. So following on from this, as you can hopefully see, the tissue at the upper back, the tissue at the back of the shoulder gets very tight and stiff. The third piece of the puzzle follows the exact same line of thinking again, and this rounded shape, what we see coming back to the same posture is, again, the arm dropping forwards, pulls on the upper back, pulls on the tissue at the back of the shoulder, but deeper to the joint, the body has what's called a joint capsule. So you've got your arm and your shoulder blade, as it sort of looks to me here at the moment. And what the body has is it has a thing that surrounds that joint called a capsule. So the shoulder joint capsule, pretty much every joint in the body is wrapped up in a real strong connective tissue. It encapsulates that area, gives it some stability. But when we're often in a position where we're sort of dropping down and sort of hanging off that shoulder in a bad posture, we're always pulling and sort of trying to draw down on that. So what happens is that tissue reacts and gets stiff to compensate for that. So not only does the upper back get stiff, the muscles at the back of the shoulder get stiff, but the joint capsule itself, particularly the I guess the posterior aspect or the aspect at the back of the shoulder, becomes tougher and tighter because it has to. It's trying to cope with that extra load, that uncomfortable load that it's dealing with. And it's fine to get you to be able to do those, to perform those bad postures consistently. But if you then want to use your shoulder and have a healthy shoulder, you're doing so with another deeper handbrake on. And we've gone through this exercise before, and I'll link it up here. You'll see the eye pop up in a second. But we want to put you in a position and stretch the back of that shoulder joint to free up the amount of motion that you have and create some more space back into that gap again. So if that gap has become sort of stiff and tight from being in a bad position, we're going to feed some slack into that again so you've got more room to move. And again, how that looks can be different for a few people, but what I recommend for my patients is if you can get onto the hands and knees, we ideally want you to be in a good position. So shoulders comfortably back, so that might mean that you have to drop your chest in a little bit. And all I want to get you to do here is keeping your chest parallel to the ground. I want you to imagine that your arm bone is pushing out the back corner of your shoulder. So how that looks is we're going to get you to shift your whole body weight across over the side you're trying to stretch. And we want to maneuver yourself until you feel like you're getting some pressure on the back of that shoulder. Now, if you have any discomfort at all at the front, it means you're in a bad position. So you want to reset to a good position. Instead of coming all the way over, you might need to come down a little bit more and then across, or over the top of it a little bit more and then across, just to see which position gives you a more specific pressure at the back and nothing else through the front. Because if you have an impingement and you're in this position and you feel that same impingement, there's no guarantee it's not going to get annoyed or irritated from this position. And this stretch should be a good thing for you, but it can quickly become an annoying thing if you feel that. So make sure that when you're in this position, you only feel some tightness or some pressure at the back of that shoulder, and it may only be subtle, and all we want you to do is stay there. And we can make this more specific by doing it on your elbows. Do the same thing where you just come across till you feel some pressure at the back of that shoulder. We just want you to stay there and hang out there. And what this does, as I said, it just gets that head of the humerus, sort of stretches out that stiffness at the back of the capsule. And again, what it does, you should see this immediately, is you should feel like it gives you more range of motion or a sense of more range of motion than what you had previously. So those three exercises, the two with the ball in the upper back and the back of the shoulder, and that really basic shoulder capsule stretch are three exercises that I would recommend to anyone going through any type of impingement. Not only should it help with your symptoms, but it should hopefully help address the root underlying cause for those symptoms, which is something that we miss a lot. And we see it so much. So just as a quick reminder, those three exercises are only going to be good as the positions that you then put yourself into, and you can't cheat these positions. You can't necessarily rely on a brace or stiff clothing or an ergonomic setup. You have to take that responsibility yourself to hold yourself in a good position. And you can certainly layer on top of that those rotator cuff and rowing exercises to strengthen the muscles at your back, to hold you back and give you more endurance and strength. But ultimately, if you're not paying attention to those shapes, you can have all the strength in the world and it's worthless because you'll just be hanging off your passive tissue like anyone else. And you may have a little bit more tissue tolerance than someone else if you're nice and strong back there, but there's still a threshold for dysfunction at the end of the day. So the only way to guarantee that impingement doesn't exist or doesn't hang around or doesn't want to come back is to make sure that your default positions are better and those shoulders are back. So I hope that helps. Please give those exercises a go. Let me know in the comments below how you felt they went. And if you have anything particular that you like to do for an impingement syndrome, let me know as well. So again, if you did find this video useful and you think someone else might benefit from that, please show it to them, share it to them. Leave a like below. Consider subscribing if you're new, just so you can get the content as we put it out. But we're putting out these videos probably each day or as good as, so please keep an eye out on them. They're all information that we talk about with patients to hopefully make a difference for them, and if one person's going through it, there's every chance that you and someone else might be as well. So until next time, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you soon.